Well, they're actually talking about a ceasefire and to try to prevent some of the most terrible bombings and atrocities that have been taking place, but with both sides responsible, but probably more the Syrian government with barrel bombs and chlorine gas and things like that. But what they're actually talking about is a superpower negotiation to reposition themselves in the Middle East and salvage their positions with their strategic allies in the region. So this is a very peculiar situation where the Russians and the Americans are negotiating and there's no Syrians, government or opposition people there. But this is a sign of the times. This war in Syria has become a massive proxy war, including the superpowers, all the regional powers like Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the Syrian government and its opponents. And it's at these very different levels that events are taking place. This event is purely at the level of the superpowers to get a humanitarian pause. That will not touch on any of the other critical political issues where no progress has been made. And it's very hard to see how progress can be made politically because the opposition wants Assad out and Assad will not leave. Well, the Russians and the Americans can achieve that to a very large extent with the people on the ground, the fighters on the ground, who they can directly influence, which is some of the vetted rebel groups for the U.S. and the Syrian government and its various allies, Iran, Hezbollah, and others, for the Russians. That's not a problem. They've done that before. The problem is there's other groups, major groups, that are not under the influence of the Russians or the Americans, who are part of the rebels. And then you have, of course, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who are completely beyond the control of anybody. So even a humanitarian pause now, which everybody wants, especially the Syrian people, even a humanitarian pause will not allow any significant movement towards a political resolution. And this is the great tragedy and the dilemma of the Syrian war. And it's been so obvious now for about the last 3 years that we've had this situation. But the humanitarian suffering is so intense and so terrible, so inhuman, that both the Russians and the Americans feel obligated. They've got to do something to stop these pictures of children choking on chlorine gas or being starved to death from appearing on television screens all over the world every day, because it reflects directly on the superpowers as well as on the actors on the ground. Well, they want to reaffirm and expand their own strategic advantage in the region. The Russians are doing this much more effectively than the Americans right now. The Russians are expanding their contacts to the point where they feel they can host a Palestinian-Israeli peace conference of some sort. Their ties with Iran are improving. They're talking to the Saudis. They're back on talking terms with the Turks. So the Russians are much better at this right now in the short term. The Americans have long-term allies who they've worked with for many, many years. So that the one thing they're trying to do is increase their own strategic advantage, while at the same time seeing where they can work together to bring about some peaceful situation, whether it's in Syria or somewhere else. They've not had much success on this. They did have the chemical weapons issue about 3 years, 2.5, 3 years ago, but this is not something that has a lot of traction or any kind of good track record on the ground. And this is also, in a way, preparing for the next administration that's going to take over in the United States in about 4 months. Well, the Russians, I think, are pretty transparent and clear, even if they're often sometimes rough and brutal. They want to be serious players. They want to have their strategic interests taken account of. They want to be treated with respect. They want to be able to have advantages in the region that the U.S. has long had, such as trade, access to ports, access to military bases. What they're asking for is very clear and very reasonable. If you're a global power, the U.S. and the West have tried to prevent that from happening, but they've not been very successful. So it's really a question of engaging the Russians in a way that the U.S. is going to have to do soon with China, as China becomes a global power. So I think the U.S. understands that it has to do this. It has done it in the past, and it can do it again, because if you can achieve a working relationship in the Middle East that's a win-win for both sides, you might have a better chance then of doing something in the Ukraine and Eastern Europe as well. Thank you. Okay.